Now that I have covered the why of using catastrophism to explain ancient historical problems, let's get into the basics of catastrophism and start employing some of the actual science to explain some of the histories that we uncover as we dig through the past. So the first video that I did in this series was to make a case about why we should use catastrophism and the concepts therein to start to reevaluate all of our ancient histories. So to recap that, there's two main reasons why catastrophism matters, or why catastrophism should be employed in all of your ancient historical studies. Not just ancient historical studies either, by the way, even like relatively recent studies. There's a whole other thing on that. Anyway, so the two main reasons are this. The very first main reason that we should look at catastrophism is because all of our ancestors have tons of stories about it. Everywhere we look in everybody's ancient histories, we find everybody walking around having a good time, and then all of a sudden, fire starts raining from the sky, or huge mountains of water start rolling over continents, or you have, oil raining from the sky, or there's earthquakes, or you have continents being dropped into the ocean, or being raised out of the ocean, all while all this horrible cosmic stuff is going on in the sky, right? There is so much insanity in our ancient history that it's 100% insane that mainstream ignores all of these stories and they put them aside as if they're just, fantasy. None of this could possibly happen. You can't have, stars raining down from the sky. They're crazy. You can't have gods in the sky fighting, and initially that all kind of makes sense, right? You're like, well, yeah, okay, fine. Gods are kind of a weird situation here. We don't see Zeus fighting up in the sky. But what I talked about in that first video is that once you get rid of the concept of a sky daddy, like a legitimate person up there in the sky with thunderbolts, and you replace that sky daddy with a planet, suddenly everything becomes crystal clear. And suddenly all of our ancient ancestors' histories start to make sense. And this brings me to the second reason why catastrophism should be employed in all of your historical studies. And that reason is simple. It's because the science leads us in that direction. This is probably the most crucial point that we can make about catastrophism. The science is there. So if we use my quick example of taking, anytime you see a god mentioned in a story generally, and it's got to be a god, not necessarily a demigod, but if you replace the word god with planet, suddenly, all of these stories start to make at least a little bit of sense. Now, the next problem we run into, of course, is the fact that now we have to say, well, then our ancestors could see planets. Well, then you're crazy. Well, here's the other side of this. There is nothing in the science that says our ancestors could not have been witnessing planetary events that were more closer to home, right? So Jupiter may have been closer to Earth than it is now. Now that sounds crazy at first, even to the scientific mind, and I get that. Your average classically trained scientific mind will immediately get a revulsion feeling towards that notion. You will immediately throw up defensive walls. And this is normal. I'm not talking bad about anything. I'm not saying that, oh, your defensive walls are bad. But if you're Westernly trained, the reality is all of us have been pre-programmed in a very specific direction, and the walls of defense that will pop up in your mind against notions like, oh hey, Jupiter may have been closer to Earth, is a problem that everybody has to overcome while you're starting to learn anything. So the reality is, if we're approaching any subject, how should we be approaching that subject? We should be approaching it with objectivity and, of course, employing the scientific method and also critical thinking skills, right? But here's something that you probably don't really think about. If when I make a statement such as Mars and Venus were closer to planet Earth only 2,000 years ago, and if your immediate reaction, your subconscious reaction, a reaction that you had no control over, if you had a reaction that popped up in your head that was like, no, that's not possible, you're crazy, there's no way Mars and Venus could ever have been in the sky, how did, our ancestors did not see these planets fighting in the sky. If your first reaction was a defensive reaction like that, that is your pre-programming coming out of your subconscious to immediately try to discard a possible truth. Now, the implications for that are pretty deep and pretty messed up. I don't want to go into it, but I just wanted to point it out really fast that if you're classically trained, or classically Westernly trained, I guess I should say, then what you're going to find is you are going to find that you have psychological barriers that are going to prohibit you from truly understanding or engrossing yourself in this kind of material. So I only point this out not because I'm trying to go all schizo or crazy or whatever. What I'm trying to tell you is to be aware of these subconscious barriers that will pop up as you start to study. I mean, it could be studying anything really, but a lot of the concepts that I'll be dealing with here are going to be very foreign to somebody just getting into this. Not only is it going to be foreign to you, but it's going to be like hostile to you in a sense. What I would ask you to do is ask yourself this question: why am I so vehemently opposed to hearing these scientifically possible conclusions? Ask yourself that question and do a deep dive into your own psyche at some point. I would do it a lot because there's a lot of psychological barriers that you, as a classically trained historian or scientist, are going to have deeply embedded in there, and you're going to have to tear those walls down. That's probably actually a completely different show, or that is a completely different show on its own, and maybe I'll cover that later. But anyway, I'm not going to waste any more time with this. Not being schizo, but the reality is that is going to be your biggest barrier to getting into the basics of catastrophism. So do me a favor, do your best to try to get rid of those walls as they pop up while I talk about this subject. Alright, enough schizo stuff. So the way I want to start this is we're going to start with basics. And I can't think of anything more basic than cave art. So here we have a rock wall full of what we would call Stone Age art or cave art or whatever they want to call it. Rock art. I think rock art is the official term. At first glance, this looks like a 3-year-old just went crazy, right? I mean, when we look at this, you're like, wow, there's like stick figures. I guess there's maybe a rainbow. And then there's all these just, I mean, whatever designs they were, this, you know, it's either a 3-year-old or a drunk dude, right? Whoever drew these obviously had no talent. And of course, the mainstream will immediately say, well, yeah, cave people drew this. Cave people are stupid, and this was the grand total of their intellectual capability, right? So the first thing we can say is a kid probably did not do this because you got to chisel it into the rock and you got to have a little bit of patience to get it in there. I know cave art initially seems like it would take you 2 seconds to do, but go pound on a rock wall somewhere and see how long it would take you to even do like a stick figure. It takes a second, and it takes a little bit of strength, especially to get it, you know, deep enough to where it will last as long as these symbols have lasted. So already we can deduce a couple of things just from looking at this for 2 seconds at a slightly higher level. We're not going crazy yet. So just looking at this kind of an ancient historical document, I mean, we could call it a document, I get. Anyways, the point is maybe not a maybe not a document. This ancient historical rock. If we were to go and talk to any kind of a historian or any kind of an archaeologist, they're going to say that this is a few thousand years old, at least, right? They're going to date it pretty far back. And they're going to say that, you know, dumb people did this. People who had no clue what they were doing, you know, they did this. They had the mentality of a 2-year-old. That's going to be their conclusion. All right, fine. We're going to move on from those people. Let's look at a different perspective. So one of the things I just said is that to get this kind of rock art into the rock itself, it's going to take a little time, and it's going to take a little bit of energy. So an adult, or at least a young adult, probably did this artwork. Okay, fine, an adult did this, you know, childlike drawing, fantastic. So what? Why does that even matter? Why does this basic concept matter to anything, especially catastrophism? So let's build a case for this. In fact, this will actually be a really good critical thinking exercise for you, for all of us. It's really good stuff. So we can probably safely say that a young adult or an adult drew this. So if it's a young adult or an adult, that means they've got some, you know, decent intellectual faculties going on. Because don't forget, mainstream anthropologists have no problem telling us that humans, as we are today, as you and I look, think, feel, whatever, we existed in this state right now 100,000 years ago. So whoever technically did these rock art drawings would have had the exact same capabilities as you or I, at least. Right, now that's mainstream science. You know, we can go into deeper science that goes further and deals with even a higher level of this, but just for fun, let's just use mainstream anthropological garbage. That's fine. That'll suit us just fine, because if we can use mainstream garbage to prove catastrophism, just imagine what we can prove with real objective science. So let's do that. Yeah, that's perfect, actually. All right, so let's keep going. So whoever would have done this rock art would have been like us, right? There's a really good chance that there would have been someone like you sitting there listening to this that would have been able to do that. Now, here's my next question. So we're going to say that a human adult-ish person did this. So they had a little bit of muscle, they had a little bit of brain. The next question is why do this at all? Right? I mean, do you just waste your time going to a rock and start carving stuff into it, especially what seems like random garbage? Have you ever done that? Have you ever known anyone to do that? Now, I ask this for a reason, because this matters. If you have seen a ton of people wandering off to go carve stuff into rock, then that would be interesting evidence on a humanity situation, right? Like, why would humans be drawn to just randomly carving stuff into rock all the time? Now, we don't see that, do we? We have no observational evidence to prove that humans are constantly trying to carve stuff into rock, right? That's not a normal thing. So if it's not common that people carve stuff into rock, then the next deduction that we can make is we can say, all right, whoever decided to take the time to do this went out of their way to do it, and it must have mattered to them to some degree. They probably didn't just like get drunk, run over to a rock and start banging a rock into a rock, trying to carve some crap. That probably didn't happen. Now, obviously, I can't 100% say that some drunk cave dude didn't do this, but the chances are that no, that didn't happen. I don't know of any drunk person that randomly walks off to go draw a cave art. Like, I've never seen that, and I've never heard about it. So we can probably establish that whoever did this cave art was relatively insane mind and probably had a purpose. Not probably, in fact, definitely had a purpose. Now let's follow this train of thought. If there was purpose behind making all of these apparent squiggles on the rock, what was the purpose? What would be the purpose of an adult going to this rock and scribbling all of these lines? Now, the first thing we could say is, well, is it a language? We can look at this, and I can't deduce a language out of it, and I have not seen any scholar deduce a language out of it either. And it certainly does not seem to follow any linguistic characteristics that we would expect from even a basic language, really. Even a pictograph language isn't quite this squiggly. I'm happy to be wrong. You know, I'm sure maybe there's some examples out there of pictogram languages being displayed kind of haphazardly and crazy, but generally that's not what we see. Even a pictogram-based language still follows some sort of organization, right? Organization is key to language. If you don't know the organization to your language, you will never be able to read it. So we can probably next establish that whatever is here is not some dude writing on a wall. He's not writing like the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? And he's probably not, graffitiing his name. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Does not seem like a language. Okay, fine. We can now get rid of the language postulate. So what else could it be? It's art. We already know it's rock. It's called rock art, for God's sakes. It's art. We already established that. Fine. The reason why I wanted to discard the language stuff and set the stage for who would have drawn this is so that we can have a solid foundation moving forward as we build a case to what this stuff is actually showing. Let's keep going. So at this point, we have now decided to establish that these scribbles on this rock are art, and that's why we call it rock art, right? Or cave art, depending on where you find this kind of stuff. All right, it's art. The thing that sucks about art is that art is completely up to interpretation, right? So you can pretty much draw a line on a blank piece of paper and sell it for $8 trillion and money launder, and people will call it art. That's how simple art is. So we can look at this and be like, wow, that's a little more complicated than a single line on a piece of paper. These guys, these cave dudes, whoever these people were, they must have been artists. Right? Okay, it's art. Yeah, look at this. They were doing art. This must have been the evolution of art. I mean, look at it. It follows the theory of uniformity perfectly. We start art with stick figures and squiggly lines that even a modern 2-year-old would be absolutely ashamed of to call art. right? That's what the mainstream will tell us, that this is just a transitory time in human history that shows how we start with nothing and eventually evolve to what we find today. Fine, the theory of uniformity is pure poison, and I will not get into it further here, but that would be the general mindset of how mainstream would explain what we're seeing here. And then, of course, the rock art would eventually evolve into us painting stuff like whatever Van Gogh does and today in Photoshop. All right, fine. So that seems to make sense, and that's pretty much where I'd say 99% of the general population moves on from this particular subject. All right, we are not going to move on. We are going to keep looking at this using critical thinking. So, why else would somebody come over here and start drawing on a rock wall? Did our ancient cave dude just have a bout of inspiration and he just had to draw stick figures and I guess rainbows and squiggly lines and spirals and wavy things and whatever else is on there, right? You look at this picture and it's like, what is all of that, right? All right, he's an artist. Artists can be crazy. I get that. And so, once again, you can actually now walk away at this point and being like, yeah, I guess it is art. That's fine. It's art. And the cave dude was just crazy. Artists are crazy. There's no reason they would not have been crazy back then, and they could have just done this. All right, fine. Maybe. But let's go further. Would a cave dude back in the day really waste time and energy sitting there drawing all this random garbage when there's probably other stuff that has to be done? And the fact that we don't see this kind of stuff all over the place, like everywhere, the fact that we only find it sporadically here and there, all over the world, this is a North American situation, but we only find it sporadically, which shows us that rock art is only being created here and there and on rare occasions. It is not the norm, right? We go to Egypt, for example, we find writing all over the place, right? Everywhere there's writing, and Egypt's been around a while, so there's been a lot of time for their writing to disappear, but it's still everywhere, right? So in Egypt, we can make the safe conclusion that writing was important and enough people could do it to where it actually influenced their society and it mattered. Here, for these cave dudes, I don't even want to call them cave dudes, but we'll stick with that term for now. These people were obviously not doing anything to that level whatsoever. So this stuff being rare tells us something. What it tells us is that if they were wasting their time doing this, when they probably should have been doing 8 trillion other things like basically surviving, there must have been a good reason to take the time to do this. Now, why would you stop something in your life, your regular everyday life, and go and draw something on a rock? Have you ever had that inclination to want to drop everything you're doing and be like, man, I gotta go draw on a rock? Of course not. You've never been in a situation to where you ever felt you had to go draw on a rock. At least I don't think you have. You shouldn't. If you do, you might want to seek some help. But it's not normal for people to have this weird inclination to just go and find a rock and draw squiggly lines. So if they're spending the time to do this, there must have been a reason. So that leads us to that basic question. What's the reason? Why do this? We could say that it's an artist and that this was indeed just some artist learning how to draw. Okay, you could say that. It is possible. I can't 100% say no, that's not possible. But is it likely? We don't really have any evidence that would really support that conclusion. I don't have any evidence that says, hey, these people that lived here, whoever they were, I don't even know who was here, but I technically have no reason to go ahead and make the conclusion that some artist or ancient cave artist drew these pictures to further the field of art, right? I have no evidence for that. All right, great. So if I don't have any evidence of that other than the possibility, we can move on. We can discard that possibility for now. That's the beauty of doing a thought experiment or basic critical thinking, is that we can have fun eliminating possibilities and following the trails of other pieces of evidence, no matter where they might lead. Now that is the key. I probably should have said that at the beginning. Follow multiple trails to see where they lead and don't be afraid to do it. All right, so we're going to discard the artist theory right now. That's fine. No big deal. Why else would you draw stuff on a rock? Well, it's probably not a language. I feel we've established that. So without further evidence of somebody running up to me showing me the rock art alphabet, I'm going to also discard the alphabet situation, that theory. So that leaves us with another question. Why would you waste time drawing anything into a rock? Is it possible that what we are seeing here is a record? But a record of what? What would be recorded here? What would cave dudes be recording? So we could look at this and be like, well, maybe they were starting to figure out, I don't know, ownership of land, or maybe they did have cattle or something and they owned cattle, or maybe there's some sort of rudimentary, I don't know, birthday chart here that we don't understand. There could be a variety of basic record-keeping things going on here, but the more we look at the situation here, it's hard to say what that would have been, right? Because none of this seems to line up with anything, right? We have squiggly lines, we have swirls, we have rainbow things, we have dots. You know, what the hell is this technically recording? I mean, what would have that have recorded with respect to basic human civilization records? So upon further inspection, it doesn't seem like anything that we would generally think you would record with respect to a civilization situation, you know, day-to-day life, really lines up here. I mean, we don't have any reason to believe that that's what we're seeing. Okay, so it's probably not a record of some sort of civilization, day-to-day life stuff. What else could it be? I mean, right now we're screwed. I mean, this is what would get rid of everybody else. Anybody that made it this far would basically drop out. They'd be done. They'd look at it, scratch their head, and be like, I don't know. I guess cave people are crazy, and they move on with life, right? They're done. They don't care about this, and who can blame them, right? Okay. So let's take the next step. Let's look at the actual shapes. All right, what are these guys drawing? Let's ask that question. What are we seeing here on the wall? Now, there is a lot of stuff represented here. I love this cave art here. This is a really good one to study. But I'm just going to focus on, let's say, two symbols here. Let's start with the spiral. Why draw a spiral? Why take your time out of your day to record a spiral? On one hand, you could still say, well, it's just art. But once again, we have to look at all. If we take the piece as a whole, the art thing kind of goes out the door. So let's keep following the trail of recording. Why would you record a spiral? What does that even mean? Like, in your life, can you ever think of a time when you would have felt the need to record a spiral? Like, I can't think of anything. So for some weird reason, these people thought this was important, or whoever drew this, people or person. They thought the spiral was important. So what we would do next is we need to find out what would have influenced the concept of the spiral. Now, the spiral, it's an interesting shape. That's fine. You know, you can have fun drawing a spiral. But if we are going to go with the record-keeping hypothesis, why a spiral? What the hell are we recording? There's no spirals that we deal with in regular life, really. I mean, unless you're constantly being hypnotized. You know, why else would we record a spiral? So if we think about the cave dudes back in the day, what would they have been seeing? What was their surroundings like? Because if they were recording something, there's a good chance that whatever they were recording no longer exists today, right? I mean, we know for a fact that the planet Earth, we know for a scientific fact that Earth has absolutely drastically changed its environment over the past few thousand years. Like, there's no debate. You can ignore it all you want, but the Earth has absolutely changed all over the place. All right, I'm not getting into the climate change thing. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is there is evidence for Earth going through events that changed the crap out of everything. Anyway, where this particular rock art is found, it's all desert. You're not building a civilization out here. So it's a safe bet to say that whoever did this rock art, their environment was different. If they were around here, they were able to survive. I mean, they were hanging out. And of course, scientifically, we know this as well, that the area was more lush than it is today. So what in their environment would cause a spiral? So we're at the disadvantage because we don't know exactly what that environment looked like because it's gone, right? It no longer exists. We can look around, we can try to make inferences, but the reality is in this area, there's no spiral shape anywhere that I've ever seen and that I've ever heard anybody bring up that would inspire the spiral. So where is the spiral coming from? I mean, what's going on? Why is spiral? So if they're recording something, that's fine, but what is it? I mean, so if we look around the ground, there's nothing on the ground that really represents a spiral. So it's not the environment, probably. If it was there, it's long gone, and that of course is a huge disadvantage to us. But for now, we have no evidence that there's any kind of a spiral situation going on in the ground environment. For the civilization, what did the spiral mean? I don't know. We don't have any evidence that would say, hey, look, the spiral was important to that civilization because of X and Y reasons. We have none of that either. All right. So where else can we look to try to explain the spiral? Using the process of elimination, we now know that we've looked at the ground, we don't see anything. We've tried to look at the society for whatever we can see, I guess, and there's nothing. We have no evidence there. Where else could we possibly look? Oh yeah, the sky. Oh yeah, we can look up. You know, the big sky that we all have to deal with every day of our lives? The sky. It never ceases to amaze me how often the sky is ignored by historians, archaeologists, etc. The sky matters. All right, so fine, the sky. What are you talking about? What the hell am I talking about, the sky? If we look up at the sky right now, do you see a spiral? Right now, no, I do not. I do not see a spiral. But I wonder, is there any precedence scientifically? Yes, there is. And there it is. There's the spiral in the sky. Now, for those of you who think this is a demon portal to hell, good news, you're already in hell, so you don't need to take a portal to it. So no, it's not a portal to hell. What it is, apparently, according to scientists and everybody all over the world, is that it is a rocket launch gone awry. Regardless of whatever it truly was, the reality is what we're seeing here is an object in the sky that created a spiral. All right, I'm not going to get into the semantics of what this actually is. The main point is that in the sky, in our atmosphere, we were able to see something create a spiral. Now, this is important. What we have here is observational fact. We can scientifically look to the sky here and even watch videos of it. I'm not going to post that because I don't want to get all in trouble with YouTube. But what we have here is proof that in the atmosphere, or that in space above us in the sky, you can create a spiral with an object. So if we look back to our rock art and we start seeing the spiral, is it possible that the cave dudes drew what they saw in the sky? And this leads us to a really good explanation of what the rock art is. Because if you were back in the day looking up at the sky, or even today, just to see something like that is pretty cool. Even if you see a rocket launch going over your house, man, the atmospheric effects are amazing. But if you were 2,000, 3,000, 6,000 years ago and you saw something like this happen in the sky, that would be one hell of an event. And what do humans do? They record extraordinary or interesting events. Now we start to get real answers to all of our questions. So the first question, why would anybody waste their time drawing on a rock? Well, you might waste your time drawing on a rock if something amazing happened and you wanted to preserve it. Why on a rock? Well, back in the day, they didn't have paper, not that we're aware of. They didn't have other ways of recording this. So when somebody saw this going on in the sky, what was the one main thing that they had access to? They had a rock wall and another rock that they could pound into that rock wall. So if you see that spiral, you can run over there really quick and you can start chiseling it into the rock really fast. This will also explain the rudimentary artistic skills that we see presented on the rock wall. Whoever did this obviously was not an artist. Not only were they not an artist, but they weren't trained in banging images into a stone. Why would you be? How many people do you know are trained into banging an image into a stone? If I put you in front of a blank rock wall and I said, hey, I need you to record a spiral, here's your rock wall and here's your rock, I guarantee that your masterpiece is going to look just like this kind of stuff. Now suddenly the rock wall art is making a little more sense, and it's making sense on a human level and on a scientific level. So now you can say, and you can fight back and say, well, all right, fine, there might have been a spiral in the sky. I mean, it can happen. We've seen it. There's proof. You can't argue that. There's no way you can say it can't happen. So that's, you're screwed on that front. But how would cave dudes have seen a spiral in the sky, especially if the spiral is created by a man-made object? And what am I saying that there were rockets back in cave dude times? Not at all. But what I am saying is that we do have precedents for objects creating a certain kind of configuration in space or in our atmosphere. And that's a scientific fact. And we also know for a fact that rockets are not the only object that can create all these very interesting atmospheric and spatial conditions. So, what we can now conclude is that the rock dudes, they were probably recording something they saw in the sky. And we have derived this conclusion from nothing but scientific fact and observable science. That's the beauty of this kind of deduction. Now, the mainstream person, or you classically trained person, is going to fight against this. But the good news here is, and I'm not going against anybody, by the way, I'm trying to break you of that psychological conditioning. You have to remember that everything I just presented is based on science. It's a scientific-based conclusion. There's nothing, you can argue it, but the reality is the evidence is there, and you have now got to disprove that evidence. Now, the next question you might now throw at me would be like, fine, okay, whatever, so somehow these guys are seeing spirals in the sky, but what creates all that? What's the real science behind that? Because now we have to figure out what was doing that. And good news, we actually have an entire science that can reproduce all of this stuff. And that science is called plasma physics. Plasma physics is able to replicate these kind of shapes in the laboratory. Now, I'm not going to go into an in-depth discussion on plasma physics here. This is just an introductory, but I highly recommend you go and you look up plasma physics and electric universe theory, and you can start to see the real science behind this kind of stuff. So, is it possible that the cave dudes back in the day were witnessing something cosmological going on that happened to them back then that no longer is happening now? Absolutely. That is absolutely 100% scientifically possible. There is no reason to doubt that. There is no reason to think that if we don't see an event taking place right now, that event could never have taken place or won't take place in the future. That's ridiculous. But that is the mainstream scientific position. They literally hold to that as their explanation as to why something like this isn't possible. And that position is scientifically untenable. Do not take that posture when you start to dig into science and historical situations. Now, at this point, you can be like, fine, everything, Now, at this point, we've painted a scientific picture of something that people in the past saw that would have been amazing and they recorded. What does this have to do with catastrophism? So we have people drawing on a rock at this stage. We also know that during these time periods that there were plenty of advanced civilizations on Earth. Why would anybody take the time to draw on a rock in this crude fashion when there should have been other kinds of technologies and other kinds of ways to transmit this image? The reason why is exactly what our ancestors say. These people only had rocks left to write down what they were seeing, to record what they were seeing, because their civilizations had been utterly destroyed at this point. These people weren't dumb. They were not cave people. They were simply working with what they now had at the time. Because at this point, tons of civilizations on this planet had been absolutely annihilated and thrown back into the Dark Ages, right? Or the Stone Age, I guess I should say. These people got scattered all over hell and back. Whatever civilization they used to be a part of, there's a good chance that it was absolutely annihilated and it's gone. They only have rocks to record this stuff on there. Let's go a little further. Why even bother recording it? The reason why they recorded it is because they were intelligent. They knew that this stuff was important. They wanted to make sure that whoever lived in the future could understand and see what they went through. This was the only way that they had to transmit these kinds of events that they saw in the sky. They just carved them in rock. Right? These things were recorded for posterity for us. They were telling us, hey, look, this is the kind of stuff we saw in the sky. Right? And unfortunately, I don't know if it's a warning or if it's just a flat recording, because once again, there's no language on here, but at the very least, it's something. And if we can make those connections, or if we find ourselves seeing these kind of plasma formations in the sky again, we will then have a better understanding of what truly happened to the people in the past. Now, this is running longer than I wanted it to, but I think I've made at least a good critical thinking Now this is running longer than I expected it to, but so far we've made a good case for rock art being a recording of something that people saw in the sky. Now I also said I was going to do another symbol, so I'm not going to go into the details of this symbol, but I'm just going to leave you with it because basically it's the exact same explanation that we just went over from the spiral. So here you can see what is apparently a stick figure with two circles on either side. Next to it is a real plasma formation created in a laboratory, and they match perfectly. It is entirely possible that what our ancestors are recording on these rock art walls are not just random symbols made by 2-year-olds. It is possible that all of these things that we see embedded in the rocks are what our ancestors saw in the sky before, during, and after they were absolutely annihilated by huge catastrophic events.